Hello everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Arthur Greenwood Unscripted. Today I'm going to be reviewing this book, Democracy, the God That Failed by Hans Hermann Hoppe. If you haven't heard of this book, it's it's a very controversial book. Hans Hermann Hoppe is an Austrian economist and historian and philosopher. If you're interested in sort of the libertarian spheres, you've probably heard of him. He's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He's the guy who came up with argumentation ethics, which is some of the worst philosophy that I've personally read. But he's an interesting guy. I definitely don't agree with him. He's an anarcho-capitalist. I am not. He's a libertarian extremist. I'm not. He's a reactionary. I am not. Don't think that by reading this book and talking about his arguments, I'm endorsing Hans Hermann Hoppe. I am certainly not. That being said, his arguments are very interesting, and even if we don't agree with his conclusions, I think we can learn a lot by analyzing some of the models that he creates and some of the incentive structures that he lines up. I am not a monarchist, but the arguments he lays out here can help us to improve our own system and figure out ways to make it work more smoothly. And also to clarify, Hans Hermann Hoppe is also not a monarchist. He thinks that monarchy is preferable to democracy, but he's actually, as I said, an anarcho-capitalist. So he would rather there be no state at all. He wants there to be competing private law firms, private judges, and stuff like that. And we'll talk about that in some other video. But for now, I just want to talk about his arguments against democracy. So he starts it off with acknowledgements. He thanks Lew Rockwell, who I have met when I was at the Mises Institute. I got a picture with him on his 80th birthday. So that's kind of cool. He's also crazy. He once wrote an article saying that drunk driving is fine. He thanks Walter Block, who I hate. Walter Block's just an edgelord lunatic who got kicked out of the Mises Institute for hating Palestinians too much. He thanks Joseph Salerno, and he thanks his wife, Margaret Hoppe. That's kind of cute. Actually, Margaret Hoppe was a sponsor of mine when I went to the Mises Institute, so it's kind of cool. I'm one of her favorites. Just kidding. I'm sure she just gives them a set amount of money and they randomly assign it to students. What's interesting about Hoppe's approach is that even though he's an economist, he really mixes together economics, philosophy, sociology, history, and by kind of taking all those fields together, he's able to create, in my opinion, a much more interesting argument. Kind of reminds me of the idea of the Renaissance man. I mean, there's a quote that Thomas Jefferson is the last person to know everything. And I think there's something to that. Not Thomas Jefferson specifically, but we used to think of intellectuals as, in order to be an intellectual, you need to know something about philosophy, but you also need to know something about music and history and geometry. And there was an idea that you don't focus on one particular field. You don't specialize. Intellectuals should have general knowledge. They should understand the world and society and culture and the classics as a whole. And there's something very beautiful about that. I think that we've kind of lost that. And Hoppe says in his book that because a lot of economists don't know about history and a lot of historians don't know anything about economics, they're both kind of missing a lot. And by kind of merging the two disciplines, he wants to shed some light on what really happened with the transition to democracy. So his introduction is a history lesson. He says that World War I really marks the moment where monarchies and the old world order, the old European order, fell apart and was replaced by democracy, by liberal democracy, what he calls the Pax Americana. And he kind of blames Wilson for this, I think a little bit unfairly. He kind of talks as though Wilson single-handedly wrote and approved the Treaty of Versailles, to kind of just destroy Austria and Germany, when really, France was the main one who wanted revenge. Hope I pronounced that right. Probably didn't. Anyway, he says that before World War I, you had all these great houses, all these centuries-old European monarchies, and Wilson and the rest of the American liberal elite hated that. They hated aristocracy and monarchy, and they decided to tear it all down and build something new, build democracy. And he makes some really interesting observations here. I'm just going to kind of read this paragraph. He says that World War I was so terrible because it was ideological. He says, as an increasingly ideologically motivated conflict, the war quickly degenerated into a total war. The time-honored distinction between combatants and non-combatants and military and civilian life fell by the wayside. For this reason, World War I resulted in many more civilian casualties, victims of starvation and disease, than of soldiers killed on the battlefields. Moreover, due to the ideological character of the war, at its end, no compromise peace, but only total surrender, humiliation, and punishment was possible. Germany had to give up her monarchy. The new German Republic was burdened with heavy long-term reparations. Germany was demilitarized. However, Germany was not dismembered and destroyed. Wilson had reserved this fate for Austria. And again, I think he's kind of unfairly putting too much blame on Wilson as opposed to France and the other powers. But regardless, his point is true. World War I was very ideological. It wasn't seen as like, yeah, we're fighting them because we want territory. Or, yeah, we're fighting them because, they're a rival power and they're threatening our trade routes or something. It was very much, we're fighting them because they're evil. We're fighting them because they are autocracies and we need to make the world safe for democracy. And Hoppe talks a lot about this idea that as war has become a matter of ideology, it has become much more brutal. Because when you don't see your enemy as a rival, but as evil, it becomes acceptable to kill all their women and children and burn down their cities. Firebombing of Dresden, dropping the nuclear bombs on Japan. Things like that are only palatable if you see your enemy as this kind of embodiment of evil and as more than an enemy, but an enemy to your entire way of life that must be completely destroyed. This idea of total surrender led to unbelievable loss and horrible things in both world wars. And in World War I specifically, the way Germany was treated turned into the Weimar Republic and burdened with these insane reparations that caused them to completely collapse. Their economy was just destroyed by these reparations and all these punishments that were inflicted on them. And they started having hyperinflation, and all the savings of the middle class were wiped out, and Adolf Hitler came to power. Great job, everyone. You really taught Germany a lesson. Now we have Hitler on our hands. And by the way, even Keynes saw this coming. He wrote a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, saying that if we do all these punishments on Germany, that's going to lead them to starve to death. There's going to be children starving in the streets of Berlin. And he was right, and it led to the worst war of the 20th century. Let's see, what else does Hoppe talk about? Oh yeah. So, as I said, Hoppe is an Austrian economist, and he therefore is very interested in the history of Austria. Austria, of course, being one of the monarchist powers of the Central Powers in World War I that was destroyed by the détente. And he talks about how Austria under the monarchy was just this pillar of culture and civilization and beauty. He says, even democratic intellectuals and artists from any field of intellectual and cultural endeavor could not ignore the enormous level of productivity of Austro-Hungarian and in particular Viennese culture. Indeed, the list of great names associated with late 19th and early 20th century Vienna is seemingly endless. He lists a few names here, and of course he lists his mentors, Mises, Karl Menger, Hayek, but he also mentions people like Ludwig Boltzmann. He's the guy who came up with the Boltzmann brain hypothesis, which scared me quite a lot when I was a teenager. He mentions Karl Popper. He mentions Ludwig Wittgenstein, my man, the guy who solved all of philosophy. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but I do like Wittgenstein quite a lot. He mentions, let's see, Sigmund Freud. He mentions a bajillion names. Most of them I have never heard of. He mentions Brahms. All these great composers, thinkers, legal theorists, sociologists, historians. And his point is that, there's kind of a stereotype that monarchies are backwards, right? Nothing happens there. They're undeveloped. They're just under this burden of oppression. It's just like medieval feudalism all the time. And he's saying, no, look at Austria. It was like the height of Western civilization. Far from being, repressed and not being able to think freely, you had this flourishing of new ideas. Since the late 1960s or even 1970s, real wage incomes in the United States and in Western Europe have stagnated or even fallen. I'm not sure this is true anymore. This was written in 2001, but it was certainly true at the time. I'll have to look into that later. In Western Europe, in particular, unemployment rates have been steadily edging upwards and are currently exceeding 10%. The public debt has risen everywhere to astronomical heights. Similarly, the social security systems everywhere are on or near the verge of bankruptcy. And the rest of this has some really interesting philosophy of history stuff, which is really interesting because I'm a history major, but I'm getting an economics minor, and I think Hoppe would very much approve of that because he says that historians can only know the whats. They can't know the whys. They can tell you what happened, but they can't tell you why it happened. So for instance, historians can say, hey, we had democracy, and then we had the Industrial Revolution. And you might look at that and say, okay, post hoc, ergo propter hoc. The Industrial Revolution came before democracy, therefore it caused democracy. Hoppe is saying, hold on, that's a logical fallacy. What if, instead of causing the Industrial Revolution happened in spite of democracy? What if all the progress we've made in the last 200 years has been in spite of democracy rather than because of it? And he says historians can't know the answer to that, right? Because you'd have to have a counterfactual. You'd have to you can't perform an empirical test on that because we don't have access to the alternative universe where World War I never happened and Europe was still ruled by monarchies. We can't know if in that universe we'd be even more prosperous. We'd have colonies on the moon, maybe. You can only know that if you have theory. So that's why I'm keeping the economics minor, right? Because I don't just want to know what happened. I want to know why. Mentions the School of Salamanca. For all of you Tradcath Austrian economists in the audience, of which I know of precisely one. One last thing. He actually disagrees with his mentors here. It's very interesting. Because Hoppe says that monarchy is better than democracy, and that the change to democracy was a step in the wrong direction. But his mentor Rothbard and Rothbard's mentor Mises totally disagreed. As he puts it, both Mises and Rothbard had a soft spot for democracy and tended to view the transition from monarchy to democracy as progress. So he's actually saying the founders of the Austrian school were wrong. Apparently, David Gordon, who is one of the oldest person still left in the Mises circle, who was very close friends with Rothbard, he thinks Hoppe is just totally wrong, which is pretty funny to me. Thanks for listening to this Arthur Greenwood Fireside Chat. Love you all. Take care.